our illiberal attitudes are costing society a great deal, and it could get to the point where it can't be reversed. Hayek was clear. The spontaneous order which builds up this great society, it's not easily produced, but it's easily torn down. So it's asymmetrical. Everything that's been built can be torn down a lot quicker. And when it's torn down, you don't get an easy do-over very quickly.
On this episode of Liberty Curious, I sat down with Barry Brownstein, Professor Emeritus of Leadership and Economics, writer for AIER, and the Substack called Mindset Shifts. We discussed tribalism and how it relates to historical and modern political ideologies, the war between Russia and Ukraine, and totalitarian systems. Barry explains how tribalism is incompatible with liberty and how we can move away from tribalism and towards freedom. If you enjoy this podcast, make sure that you subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Google, or wherever you listen to podcasts, and make sure to check out our new AIER channel here. But usually I don't really have to take out too much, especially when I'm speaking with you.
Yeah.
So that's, it's really rare. And usually it's me that I have to censor.
Well, you never know. You may get me going and I may say some things I shouldn't be saying, right?
Yeah. Watch out for the fact checkers. They may be coming for us. Yeah. But I think we can keep things, well within the bounds. But that's what you need to do now, right? Is if you're going to post something on YouTube, you need to make sure that you stay away from certain words, which just shows you, where we're at in this. In this era where everything is censored and subject to being taken down by big tech, who are, I guess, colluding with big government, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's been shown they are. So
if you're ready, I will just pretend that we weren't talking, or not pretend, but just I'll say, hey, welcome to the show kind of thing, okay? Are you ready?
Absolutely.
So, Barry Brownstein, it's so great to be here with you today. Thank you for joining me on Liberty Curious.
Yeah, so good to be here again. It's always a joy. Thank you.
Yes, likewise. I always come back from our conversations with a lot to think about, and I think that our guests feel the same way. So I'm excited to discuss all kinds of things with you. And today we wanted to focus on tribalism, because this is what we're seeing, and this is something that you write extensively about. You're very good at reading all of the difficult books about historical events that are just horrific, that nobody else wants to read, and then summarizing those points and putting them into context with real world problems. And one of those problems that you identify is tribalism. Yeah. So can you explain what that is to you?
Yeah, well, first off, I go through all these horrible periods in history because they can't be overlooked. In order to get through that, darkness, you first have to understand it. So you can't act like it isn't there. So it's important to see all that. And all these past incidents have at their core tribalism. That is the inability for us to see other groups as equal for ourselves. Each person has inherent rights. And when we see through tribalize, we see other people as the other, as different, as objects. Only my group, only my tribal group has full rights. The other group, no, they don't. So as soon as you get beyond that, almost all the horrors of history vanish. So that's why it's such an important topic. And the whole history of our country was founded on the idea of a country founded around an idea as opposed to a tribe. Right? All other countries were founded around the tribe. Our country was founded around the idea of an idea that is a liberty, right? So we have no country if people go back to tribalism in this country. Then we're the same as every other country, seeing through tribalized, and there could be no liberty. The founding fathers were absolutely clear. A country that had no virtue, that is citizens, I should say, who were not virtuous, can never be free. And at the core of virtue has to be to see others through the eyes that they are equal, that they are the same as you with equal rights. That has to be the foundation of any system of virtue. So it's a very important issue for us to consider today.
Yeah. You said two things that were really important there. One is seeing people as not as other objects, not objectifying people.
Yeah.
That's one thing. And the other thing is, as you said, this idea of liberty not being based on or the foundation of the United States being based on liberty, on that idea, and not being based on the tribe. But now this is where the U.S. is going. It is becoming more tribal. You can see it on the left. You could see it on the political right as well. And this is what happened in history, right? If you look back to the Nazi era and the Soviet Union, they were these combating right or left totalitarian regimes, but they kind of represented the same thing.
Every single.
Have you discovered that in your reading? Yeah.
Every single case has as its core the tribe. Former Soviet Union, so many tribes, and so many things were being evaluated, even in the army back then. As I studied the army, in the battle against Hitler. They would evaluate officers on the basis of their ethnic tribe. So even back then, where they were fighting for survival, every military had a commissar who was there to see that it was correct politically, not correct tactically, but politically. And part of what was, correct, politically was there a balance in officers? You didn't have an excess amount of Jews or Kalmyks or other tribes, because that was a no-no, even though they were fighting for their, so that's how insidious tribal politics can be. You're on the verge of being, destroyed as a country, and you're still holding on to the tribe. So the identity politics. Yeah, the identity politics that sounds like. That we're now seeing now. It's horrific. And it's not going to end well for our country either. It can't end well. It has never ended well in any other time in history, and it will not end well this time either. So we have to find a way to get past it. And that journey to get past it starts with each individual. Each individual has to see with what tribal thinking is costing them personally. They don't see that it's you're not costing them a big cost. It's costing them liberty. It's costing them peace of mind. It's costing them maybe, world peace right now. And there's a huge cost to looking through tribal eyes. And seeing people as objects is part of our ego. Everybody's ego will see people as objects. Just, think about you're in a store and you're online at the supermarket, right? And are you seeing the other customers in line as objects? Are you silently, if you're in an express line, are you silently mentally, counting up that the other person has 15 items, say, instead of 14? And are you mentally cursing at them? And then are you seeing the cashier as an object? Is she moving fast enough for you or not? Everything is around our ego. Our ego sees through me, is first, me first, everything. So ego always sees, win-lose solutions, which often become lose-lose solutions is the problem. Win-lose could easily become you lose-lose. So we should be striving for a win-win. And that's what the market inherently does, right? Each person in a trade wins, otherwise the trade is not going to happen. So markets are inherently win-win.
Yeah, they're not tribal. They can't be if they're able to just exist freely. It just means that you can trade with any person, whether you like that person or not. You want their money and they want your goods, or vice versa. So it doesn't really matter if you like them. It doesn't matter the color of their skin or anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And often when people start out having certain prejudices, they get into your business, and through contact, through that constant contact with all different sorts of people, those prejudices, go away. They see that it was ill-founded. So commerce destroys the tribe. So that's why tribes try and keep people separate. If you're in a country that's tribal, so for instance, Nigeria has over 300 tribes. Who would have thought that? Over 300 tribes. And each tribe does not want you to have contact with the other tribe, to marry outside your tribe, because they're the other. So imagine that, 300 tribes in a single country.
Yeah. Well, do you think that that's better or worse than having two tribes in a country?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. Tribalized, let's just say, are very destructive eyes. Tribal cause mischief. And how deep the tribal eyes go, the more mischief there is, the more antithetical it is to freedom, liberty, and love, and peace of mind, and all these good virtues that we all strive for to have a happy life. They all go away
and
through
peace.
And
peace in the world as well. You often talk about this. Basically, all of your essays at the end come back to the individual and the individual choices that you make. And a peace of mind can lead to a more peaceful world if you follow that way of thinking. And yesterday when we were on the phone, we were talking about Russia and Ukraine. And this is a topic that nobody really wants to touch because it's so tender. But we thought that maybe we would go there as it relates to tribalism, because we see this now, right? Where either you have to choose Russia or you have to choose Ukraine.
Right.
Nobody wants to really go there and look at the nuance. So,
I was just, smiling because I thought you would go there, and I was kind of hoping that you wouldn't, but I was kind of smiling about that. But no, it is important. And it is important, and you're absolutely spot on about you don't have to choose sides. Your heart could go out to the suffering of both countries. The citizens of both countries have suffered a great deal. They are not free countries, either one. They have suffered under war. They have suffered under communism. They have suffered under starvation. They have suffered under atrocities, both sides against each other, some of which we talked about yesterday. Stalin's starvation during the 30s of the peasants in the Ukraine. Millions of peasants died. Over 5 million starved to death. About 25% of the peasantry died in horrible conditions. I mean, starvation is a horrible thing. But then World War II, when Hitler invaded, equal atrocities from Ukrainians towards Soviets. So, for instance, 200,000, could you imagine this? 200,000 Soviet army soldiers, Ukrainian ancestry, turned and joined, became auxiliaries for Hitler's troops. And those 200,000 Ukrainians, we're not talking about a couple of hundred, without which the mass slaughters of Jews and Soviet POWs could not have happened. So they helped to slaughter the Soviet POWs who did not turn. And they also were involved with the mass extermination, up to 30,000 at a time in towns, as Hitler's troops had gone through. The actual amount of Hitler's troops, the core Hitler's troops who were involved in this, was a comparatively small amount. They were backed up by the 200,000 Ukrainian soldiers who had been freed at a POW camp. So both sides have a lot of grievances here. Both sides have a lot of grievances. And it's a part of the world where there's been a great deal of suffering. So, that is not there. There shouldn't be anything I've said that justifies in any way the invasion. No, there's no justification for that. I'm just pointing out some of the history of ill will over here, but I'm not I'm justifying anything. But it comes back to now our role. Our role is to see the others, Ukrainians and Soviets, to hope that they both flourish, right? We don't want to see a solution where one side is beaten into the ground and they are destroyed, because that's not going to be consistent for harmony and peace and flourishing of other people. So we have to give Putin an off-ramp over here. So the same way in the 60s, 62, Kennedy, Khrushchev, they both strive to give each other an off-ramp. They didn't want war. They strived to give each other an off-ramp. So Kennedy removed our missiles from other countries, Turkey, which was a sore subject for Khrushchev. So to get the missiles out of Cuba, he had to give something up. And so, peace comes when we're in that state of mind. So now our job is not to be statespeople over here. Our job is not to come up with any type of solution for this very thorny problem. But our job is to stop cheerleading for war, right? Our job as people is to stop cheerleading for war. I get Putin, smash that son of a gun. Well, that's not consistent with peace, because that win-lose answer that so many people want could easily become lose-lose, where the whole world loses, right? So it's
that's
a horrible
such a great
attitude.
point.
Yeah.
And it comes back as well to what you're saying with tribalism, is always seeing others as objects. And I sense that a lot of people who are looking at this conflict on either side, that's what they're doing, is they're saying, oh, well, we want Ukraine to win, go Ukraine, go Zelensky. They're kind of like deifying the leaders, making either way, whoever they choose to deify, either Putin or Zelensky. And then all of the people, all of the casualties, all of the people who are involved in this, the regular people like you and I, they are treating as objects to those ends. They're not, they're looking at this like Sim City. like, because it's so far away. You know, it's Eastern Europe, it's Russia, it's across the world. So we don't have to deal with that. Like, we are not living with this kind of situation. So I think that perhaps, is it true that the further removed, the easier it is to objectify?
Yeah, that may be true. If you're not in contact with somebody, it's easier to treat them as objects, but as treating them as objects, you're treating yourself as objects. Since you brought up games, video games, you know, as you know, in those games, there are characters who are programmed who don't play, NPC characters, right? So by objectifying others, we become NPCs ourselves. You know, we're non-playing characters too, because we're just coming out of ego scripts in our own mind, just knee-jerk ego scripts. And so there's no freedom in that to be an NPC, right?
Doesn't sound like it. Doesn't sound like it to me. It doesn't sound like a thinking being. It sounds like somebody who's just kind of there, you know, who's just existing and not really doing much thinking or feeling.
Right. All the great thinkers throughout the eons have always, you know, pointed to an unprovable axiom. I'll admit it's unprovable, but quantum physics is pointing us the same way now, that there's an interconnected whole that is not visible to our senses. Okay. There's the underlying fabric is interconnected. Okay. Now, that's an unprovable axiom ultimately, although, as I said, physics is now starting to point us in the same way. But philosophers for the eons, long before physics came along, that is, quantum physics came along, were pointing us the same way. But to our senses, it seems that's totally nuts. How could everything be, connected? There's a separate chair. You're over there. I'm over here. Soviets are over there. Ukrainians are over there. Russians, I should say, are over there. And it seems like there's a separate, and we, through ego eyes, NPC eyes, through our programming, think about beating those other objects. But what if there is really, truly interconnectedness, then we're actually beating ourselves?
And you wrote about this. Yes, you wrote about this in one of your essays. Yeah, you talked about an Albert Einstein quote where he talks about that interconnectedness. So everything that we do, it ripples out. And so, and it makes sense. I mean, if you have these thoughts, these warmongering thoughts, and each individual has that. Everybody who's saying we're standing for Ukraine, we're standing with democracy, but what they actually want is war. And the same on the other side. If people are thinking that way as well, we need to smash Ukraine and etc. Well, what's happening there, right, is that you have these warmongering thoughts. And again, each individual makes up the society. And as you always point out, the individuals choose their leaders. So the leaders are the ones who are going to call the shots. And if you have a bunch of warmongering people who think that they're disconnected, but they want that, then their leaders are going to choose those results. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. We're not a victim of the leadership that we see. These totalitarian countries that have horrific leaders or have had horrific leaders. There was a consciousness of the country that called forth. There was these people. You couldn't have had them. As Fonda's saying, if Stalin or Hitler had been born in some other country, the United States, for instance, at the same era, Stalin could have been a bum on the subway just muttering, because there would have been no demand for his services. He'd have gotten nowhere. So It's our consciousness that calls forth so sadly, consciousness, it's a vague, concept because it's all individual, but the individual choices that all of us make to be warmongering in our own mind get somehow aggregated up. And that calls forth the pitiful choices right now. Obviously, Biden isn't even calling the shots, but you can't even imagine, right? It's beyond comprehension the way that Kennedy and Khrushchev solved the problem. You can't even imagine Biden and Putin solving these problems in the same way. You can't even imagine it because, because of the fact they're not statespeople at all.
And actually, I don't know if you saw that clip of Biden in February. This showed on Fox News and it showed all over Twitter how Biden had said, if Russia invades you, a reporter asked, if Russia invades Ukraine, what are you going to do? Right. And he spoke about the Nord Stream pipeline. And indicated, that it would, they would take care of it. And then, of course, this pipeline has been blown up. And some people, again, think that it could have been the part of the U.S. Some people think it could have been self-sabotage by Russia. Or, and again, we move towards that tribal thinking where you have to automatically decide this is what happened and this is who's responsible, and I won't accept any other evidence that might show me the truth. Let's just choose a side or remain with the side that we're already on. And then you're not able to talk about it either way, unfortunately.
You're not able to talk about it. And that warmongering in our minds is an attitude of mind that colors our whole life. It can't help but color our own our whole life because the attitude of mind stays in our own mind. It doesn't matter how many times you call Putin a terrible person, and he may be a terrible person. But that harshness in your mind, it stays in your own mind. The whole theory about anger can be, released by pounding pillows or expressing it has been shown over and over again in psychological experiments to be utterly false. The more anger that you express, the more anger you get. It does not get released. It becomes.
That's good to know. I didn't know that had been that had been disproven or. So that's good to know, actually. It makes sense. It makes sense.
Because
you think like this verbal ventilation will help, but you just end up more kind of wound up and more angry at the end, right?
It's an attitude of mind that stems from the fact that you're seeing somebody else as an object who has gotten in your way, and that you somehow have to get what you want to cast them aside. Now, that doesn't mean there are not problems in the world that have to be dealt with. That is not to say that's not the case, obviously. But how are you seeing the problem? If you're seeing the problem that you're dealing with somebody else who, has their own wants and needs too, it's easy to have a calm conversation about it. I'm talking about in your own life, but those type of attitudes, how you deal with your own life, build up to how you see the world, right?
Yes.
If you can't live this way in your own life, you're not going to be able to live this way in the supermarket, for instance. I just gave a simple example about you being in the supermarket and not being able to see other people as fully human. You're just seeing them as objects. And it becomes a way people live their whole life. Other people are irrelevant in their way or for them. That's how people get evaluated. They get put into three categories, and you never really are touched by the other person, right? You're never touched by the essence of the other person, that's why seemingly we see in society that marriages sometimes just split up so quickly, and your people don't understand how could that have happened. Well, it happened because your person was seen as an object, and as soon as the other person stopped giving them what they wanted.
Yes.
So boom, it's over, right? I never knew that person. Oh, they were really a terrible person, and I never knew that. That's the way people talk. Because it was all a deal, right? So there was no real love. The essence of love is to be able to see the inner part of each person, right? To see that essence of a person, and to, and to go beyond the surface. And so what passes for love these days is deals, right? You give me this, I'll give you this. And as if each person keeps up the deal, it's a good marriage. And as soon as you stop giving me the thing I want, right, boom, it's a bad stuff. So it even comes into that. You could see that in play too. Can you see the humanity in your partner? Really see the humanity in your partner.
So it happens across all kinds of different levels. And then, I was thinking while you were giving this example and a little bit before that, a thought started getting nurtured in my mind, which was coming back to the founding principles of the United States and how those, I guess, were ideas that were based upon Enlightenment thinkers, right? One of the things that I've read about Enlightenment thinkers was that there was a morality that was higher than tribalism, that differentiated, that changed man from being more of a tribal creature, as it was for so long, to adhering to these different moral principles. And so do you think that maybe the fact that the US and other Western countries are returning to a tribal state, like they're getting pulled back into that kind of baseline way of thinking, could that be because they've lost some sense of that Enlightenment thought?
Yeah, well, for sure. These great ideas of humanity are no longer taught in school anymore, or they're not taught as often as they were. And of course, each generation of children who goes through the school system, they become further and further, removed from these, great ideas. Who is still studying? Who's reading in school and colleges? John Locke anymore? Very few will ever open up anything by John Locke, which was a essential part of the founding of America. And Cicero, the founders were influenced by Cicero, and Cicero was influenced by the Stoic philosophers, and there's a great chain of great ideas. And of course, the Stoic philosophers saw this interconnectedness. Now they were in an era where there was still slavery, but they knew what the essential fabric was, this interconnectedness. And they, reminded themselves to not get tricked by appearances that things seem to be separate.
So do you think that then maybe it wasn't quite right what I was saying, in that, humans were tribal before, and then they came upon this Enlightenment period where they valued this morality and these ideas. There were always those kinds of thinkers that were less tribal, and maybe it does have to do with that interconnectedness and seeking virtue. So maybe it's just always been a minority way of thinking. Is that possible?
I think you're right.
And that really,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I think you're right that it's always been, minority, that people, tend to sadly function on their egoic, level. And sometimes, people start to change when they get some hard knocks. Life will teach us, and some people and other people, the vast, majority probably stubbornly don't change at all. They stick to their self-concept that their ego has formed, and they look for confirming stories to reinforce that narrative that they are telling themselves. And they don't have a very happy life. You're meant to evolve as your people, and we're meant to evolve as, societies to see that underlying interconnectedness, to see that other people are not objects. The more we see that other people are not objects, the more virtuous the society becomes, the more open we are to liberty, the ideas of rights for everybody. That's a liberty at the essence of, the whole idea of self-ownership. And the more open we all become to that. But that takes an internal journey also. It takes that internal, that sadly you may be right, that there aren't enough people who are open to going on that internal, trip towards greater freedom, which starts inside of them and then migrates out. So people become, I had an essay about habits in the past month where we get bound up in our habits. We get bound up in our habits because of the fact we don't examine the consequences of our habits. We see the short-term gain from our habit, and we don't see the longer-term costs. So we keep barreling ahead with our personal habits. And there are people who have done work, have done fabulous work of getting thousands of people to kind of effortlessly, and then that seems, preposterous, but it's true, to drop long-standing habits by just being able to see the long-term consequences for themselves. And then out of the selfish, oh my God, I never really traced through my assumptions. So I've been an NPC, that non-playing character where I'm just mindlessly carrying out my programming, because I'm not seeing the consequences. And the more you see the consequences, the more you see what the habit is costing you, the more you're able to drop it effortlessly, because you've seen it for yourself. It's not a willpower then. It doesn't make sense to keep on doing the same thing you've always done, because you see, wow, big cost to me. And so we have to be able to do that the same for societal. We have to be able to see that on that level, our illiberal attitudes are costing society a great deal, and it could get to the point where it can't be reversed. Hayek was clear. The spontaneous order, which builds up this great society, it's not easily, produced, but it's easily torn down. So it's asymmetrical. Everything that's been built can be torn down a lot quicker. So, when it's torn down, you don't get an easy do-over very quickly.
Yeah, that makes so much sense, Barry. And, coming back as well to thinking about these people who are not thinking, who will end up tearing things down quickly. I think that this relates to totalitarianism, and kind of Carl Jung, he would call it the mass man. And you were speaking earlier about the aggregate of consciousness. I guess he would have called that the collective unconscious.
Yeah.
Right. So kind of the collective wanting certain things or having a certain knowledge of things collectively. But in what you were saying there, I thought about tribalism and how that relates to totalitarianism, right? Because you have all of these people who are unthinking, who don't look at their habits, who don't challenge their way of thinking, who are seeing things egoically. And then maybe that leaves room for them to have the void that could be fulfilled by self-discovery, as Carl Jung wrote about in that book, The Undiscovered Self, post-World War II. He said, I think this is the solution to totalitarianism is self-discovery. And if more individuals did that, then we would go in a different direction, more towards liberty. So what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I absolutely concur. And I, in the past few days, had an essay about Mao's famine, 36 million killed. And the basis for that was, again, othering, where some Chinese saw other as the other. So the peasants were the others, as so often they end up being. And it was just horrific stuff I read, where you couldn't even, some people wouldn't even treat an ant that way, but they were treating human beings that way, where they were just smashing them the same way they would smash an ant. And as I said, some people will just, gather up the ants and, bring them outside their house instead of smashing them. But they were just smashing human beings, starving them, murdering them with no, regard. And that reflects a very low level of, your consciousness, a very low level of, consciousness. And those things seem to crop up all throughout totalitarian, situations. North Korea now is another good example where it's ongoing. And, they see their leadership as gods, which is hard to believe, but that's the consciousness. Now, some people would say it's come from propaganda, and it has come in part through propaganda, but it's also come, you had to be susceptible to that propaganda. If you think about what you were saying earlier about the collective unconsciousness, well, that's going to create the background for herding. Human beings herd, right? That's been, studied, and that's been seen to be true, where herding creatures, we don't like to go against a herd. And this underlying background of our beliefs, right, is creating the herd mentality, right? So, yes, as each of us changes, that herd mentality starts to change. So you don't even have to use Jung's terms, but you could think about the underlying background that's always there, the herd that drives behavior. And right now, the herd is being driven towards more and more poles, more and more polarization, and around your populist ideas. And each tribe in those polarized tribes are happy if their tribe is in power, not so happy if the other tribe is in power. But it's history says it's going to keep getting worse. And so in 24, in 28, it's going to keep getting worse. Hard to believe we may look back and think of Biden and Trump as some kind of enlightened people. Only kidding, half kidding, but it can get a lot worse. History says it can get a lot worse, right? As our own consciousness keeps heading south, right? Yeah,
well, that's a very good point. I just posted a poll the other day on YouTube, I said, like, have we reached peak insanity? You know, like, or if so, when do you predict that we will? And I think most people didn't think that we had met peak insanity. And if we would be looking at this from 2018, we would say maybe 2020 was the worst year. And then, well, 2021 was pretty bad. 2022 is not getting better. There could potentially be a World War III that we may be on the verge of, and some people may think so or not. And I pray that it isn't so. But I think that you're right in a sense that specifically because the herd, for lack of a better term, and even people who do think that they are not herd-like, or even people who are only herd-like a small percentage of the time, if they're not thinking about these things and how their thinking is contributing to this movement, and realizing that there's really a lot wrong that hasn't been resolved, then of course, when I think of history, I look back and say, well, there were these reactionary regimes, right? As I was saying before, you had the Nazis and then you have the Soviets. And so now, as you're saying, there's, like, I've been looking at this the last few years as the progressive left has been really authoritarian and illiberal. But then there is that growing force of the right who are not really centrist or who are not really conservative anymore either, but who really want to use the same kind of central planning, essentially, to solve all the problems.
Yes, we have not hit bottom by a long shot. And you know why we haven't hit bottom? And this should scare everybody. Our time is very limited in order to start to go the other way, because it's the big thing people have to understand. When the economy gets worse, and it is going to get worse, it is going to get worse, I'm fairly sure of that. Imagine a stock market downturn of 50%. Just imagine that. Or 70%. It's happened. Or 80%. What do you think the level of fear is going to be in society? What do you think if your taxes are going up at the same time, unemployment going up at the same time, inflation, let's say, I mean, all this, this is a possibility. What do you think is the level of fear? And since we have been conditioned, the herd has been, conditioned to cast blame, the politicians that will be called forth will be politicians who will be casting blame. On both sides, your politicians will be, casting blame. And the populist will rile up the, population as an attempt to gain power. And we don't have a lot of time. We don't have a lot of time because the stock market being down 50%, I offer no, prediction, but it could happen in 23. It could happen in 24. And given the consciousness of the herd right now, what do you think's going to happen? I don't want to find out. I don't want to find out. That's the point. And there shouldn't be anybody hearing this podcast who should be interested in finding out. Our time is very limited to turn around this horrible trend right now towards increasing tribalism and polarization. Our time is very limited. We've eaten our seed corn. We've eaten our seed corn of understanding of the principles by which human beings flourish. We've eaten it. It's almost all gone. So what's left? In the past, we've gone through trials and tribulations, but there was seed corn of understanding for us to eat, so to speak, proverbially eat, to keep the great principles of this country comparatively intact. And now that we've eaten the seed corn, what's left? There's no idea that we all share, no common ground of a liberty that we all share. anymore, or it's going down, that buy-in is going down. So what's left is for people to exploit the fact that we have no principles and we're frightened. Well, if we have no principles and we're frightened, wow.
Yeah. And I think, we have that bias where we don't think it could happen to us. But what I'd really like to know, and what I'm sure our audience is also wondering, is, Barry, how do we fix this? What do we do? What can we do? What can you do? What can you tell us and give us the magic answer?
Well, you shouldn't ask that question, because I could go on for 3 days about that. And I've taught 2-day workshops on that question. So
That's
it could
great.
go on and on and on. But now what's bubbling up for me is to ask people to practice in their own daily life, to just practice being kinder in their own daily life. And I'm not so much talking about behavior, because behavior comes from the attitude of mind. Don't focus on behavior; it will automatically spill out from your attitude that's in your mind. So by practicing being kinder, I mean your mindset in your mind, where you're seeing win-win, even in, I'm not just talking about in commerce, right, which is automatic. If you're an honest person in commerce, it's automatically win-win. I'm talking about bring that same honesty that comes from commerce into your own life, where you are stopped, where you catch yourself, you're more aware. Just become more aware once a day, where you've treated somebody as an object, where you really didn't give a damn about them. You just cared about getting what you wanted. So I may have even smiled at them and been nice, but it was only to get what you wanted, right? So
yes.
Just see it once a day, how you treated somebody as an object, and be aware of it. Just be aware. Don't judge yourself for it, because there's no change that comes from condemning yourself. Be aware and see how it feels to you. See if it feels good to you. I guarantee you, if you look without judgment, just see yourself. Just see yourself in the audience. See yourself on the stage, as somebody else could see you. Just see yourself on the stage of life. Okay. You're bringing a higher awareness into the situation. You've automatically separated yourself from your thinking. Why? Because you're seeing yourself from the audience position. You're seeing yourself from a higher state of mind. All right. You've separated yourself from your stream of conscious thinking, which just runs on all day, 50,000 thoughts. All right. You've separated yourself. And as you've separated yourself, see how that feels. I'm treating somebody else as an object. And you will see, if you're aware, it doesn't feel very good. Okay. It doesn't feel good to you. You may have even gotten what you wanted, but it didn't feel good. It actually didn't feel good. So yes. As you become more aware, as I said earlier, those habits automatically fall away. Okay. So as we practice that in our own life, it becomes natural. It becomes more natural to see the virtues of, as we aggregate it up to freedom, liberty, for all, and to start seeing for win-win answers, to, start advocating to give Putin an off-ramp, for instance, not to smash him, but give him an off-ramp to end this war, all right, so that everybody can stop suffering. It becomes just easier and easier, but start with your own life. Don't start with the external. We always try and fix external problems. We think if I fix the external, I'll be fine internal. But no, it starts with fixing up the internal first. And then as each of us does our inner work, things start to, magically change on the outside. We get more leaders who are more principled, right? And good things happen from that. God knows we were heading in the wrong way that way, towards greater amount of unprincipled people in your politics. So, but be principled in our own lives first. And, it becomes easy if you're just aware of your behavior more. Just observe yourself. As I was saying to you earlier today, sit at the feet of life, right? You don't need a guru or anything like that. Your own life is your teacher, right? Your own life is your teacher if you allow it to teach you, right?
Yes.
Not to condemn yourself, but to be aware, to be more aware. And
we condemn others when we condemn ourselves. It's kind of a projection of our shame and blame, right? So this is...
Yeah.
And this actually led me to an example that you wrote in one of your most recent essays. Because if what you say is true, that we are going towards the worst and that we're not out of it yet, which I tend to agree on, unfortunately, then we can do all of this self-work and mindset shift and create a more compassionate world around us, but maybe it won't reach the herd yet, and maybe we'll still have to deal with all of that. And maybe there's some historical cycles as well that we're just going through, and we have to hold on to that ride. But the example in your essay that I'm thinking of right now was an officer in the Army. Was it an American officer who was in a prisoner of war camp, and he was told that he would need to make this decision with a gun to his head. Can you recount that story?
Yeah, it's a very interesting story. It was a sergeant who was in a camp in 1945. It was near the end of the war. Sergeant Edmonds, and he was evangelical. Christian, which was his, worldview. And you don't have to have that, view in order to behave with, virtue. But for him, that helped. So the commandant of the camp said to him, out of your 1,200 men, all the Jewish soldiers have to come forth. And there were about 200 out of the 1,200. And he told his men, every last one, they, his corporals, and they all went through the barracks, and he said, we're all falling out in the morning. We're all falling out. And they all fell out. So the commandant came up and said, they can't all be Jews. Stop this nonsense. And he said, with a gun pointed at his head, all of us are Jews, and you'll have to shoot me, in order to get anything you want. So he said it calmly, with great background and calm, and the commandant went storming off. He backed down. And, there was a great calm, a great peace in Sergeant Edmonds as he acted out of that space where he saw everybody as, connected. He didn't see Jewish soldiers or not. So, and as I explain in the essay, our ego could have easily have gone the other way. Our ego could have easily have said, well, he's not actually going to harm the Jewish soldiers. He's just compiling a census to pass up the line. He just has to take a census. He's not going to harm them. And sadly, there was another camp at the same time where I think it was Camp Orb. It was another stalag where the commanding officer, he didn't turn in the Jews, but he didn't back them up in the same way. And again, there were about 200 Jews in the camp, and sadly, they were sent to some, concentration camp and died. But Sergeant Edmonds, if he had any egoic thoughts, which he didn't seem to have any egoic thoughts, all of us could have easily have had it. Well, he's not actually going to harm them, and I can't put the other men at risk. It isn't just my life. I'm putting the other men at risk too, because the commandant may lash out and kill us all. So I better, call forth the Jews. And he didn't see it that way. And it came from a deep place where I call that your big love. I call the essay. I call it big love because it's not individual, romantic love, but it's a love that comes from seeing, connectedness that is there, those invisible threads, right? Those invisible threads which unite us all, even though we can't see it. But they're still palpable. They're still palpable. We all feel it when we're in a calm, centered, peace of mind. We feel that loving, connection, between us and our friends, our family, and even strangers. We sometimes have brief encounters, right? Which could, go on for just a minute, just a very brief encounter. And yet it's an vibrant, enriching encounter, because it's not coming from our ego. It's not coming to get what we want. It's coming from a, deeper place. So the more we act out of that place, the more everything else starts to change invisibly, almost magically. So, and you're right, these things go in cycles. And right now we are heading south in the cycle. There seems to be these fractal patterns of human collective emotions that drive the herd. And right now we're being in that fear-driven cycle, which impact, financial markets too, and everything else. So it's going to be a rocky ride, but we can mitigate the worst by how we behave in our own lives. Yes, I firmly believe that's true.
Yes, and the example that you just gave described that exactly, because this individual had no choice as to his circumstances, right? And he could have just said as well, his ego might have told him, you're just following orders. And this is something that we've heard a lot over the last 2.5 years as well, when it comes to all of the different kinds of restrictions that have been placed on people's lives illiberally. I've heard that personally many times. You hear people saying it, and it's become a kind of mantra, which disconnects people from their own selves, from their personhood, and sees others as objects, where they can dissociate from the way that they're treating them because they're just following orders as well. And we know that this has been one of the things that has led to so many atrocities in the past.
And we have seen that happen. I know I've heard countless stories of medical institutions, higher education, where horrible things happen to people. They get fired for speaking out about something, or they get fired because they're unvaxxed, and some of their they get notes from colleagues who, in private, they say, "Sorry, man, sorry that I couldn't speak up for you," but they just allow it to happen, and the vast majority don't even care. They just put the other person in some category, and they don't care what happened to them. They say, "Well, you deserved it because you didn't follow the rules." And then even the people who know better, they don't speak up. They don't challenge it because they don't want the same thing to same hammer come for them. So they just stay silent. And Yeah, there is nobody coming to save us. We have to save ourselves, and we have to save ourselves by that inner work. And there's no time left. There honestly is no time left. If you, after hearing this, podcast, can't go about your day and not treat others as objects, not take the step of being more conscious about how you're seeing other people. If you can't do that, there is literally no hope for the world. There is the worst outcomes that all of us are frightened of are going to happen. So that is the step we can take. We can't solve the other problems of the world. We can't change who's president or who's in Congress overnight. We can't solve the problem of war, but we can solve the problem of war in our own mind, can't we? And we have warring minds when each of us treats people as objects. So we can, start there. It is true.
Barry, that is so beautifully said and so inspirational. And I do encourage people to read your work at AIER as well as at Mindset Shifts on Substack. You post frequently on both and, quite in detail about all of the historical things that we've spoken about today and much more. And always at the end of your essays, you come back to that mindset shift. So your Substack is well named because that, I think, is truly what it's about. And I really think that you have an inspiring message because people want to believe that they can do something to change the world. And in fact, they can, but sometimes they just think that they're going to change it in a different way. Yes. Right? They want to go all the way out here. And who is it? Is it Rumi who says, if you want to see change in the world, start with yourself? Right.
Yeah. It's a, matter of subtracting all the internal barriers, not the external barriers. So that's the good news and the bad news. It's the, good news and the bad news is because there is nothing that's stopping you from subtracting the internal barriers, right? There's nothing that's stopping you right now. And
yes,
darn it, can't I fix the outside instead? Because the price we have to pay is to be open to giving up just a little hunk of our self-concept, right? And we love our self-concept. We want our problems to go away, but keep our self-concept intact, but that's impossible because our self-concept is tied up with the problems. It can't be separated. There's not a self-concept and then problems. They're both joined. So we have to be able to open to doing that inner work.
Yeah, well, I really suggest that people take this to heart and do it. I mean, I'm going to practice this. Every time we speak, I look back inwards even more. I'm somebody who likes to do that kind of thing, but sometimes I forget, and then I end up externalizing and doing all those kinds of things. Yeah. So it always inspires me to speak with you on a personal level, and I encourage all of our listeners and all of our viewers to do that as well, to read your work and to really start exploring this stuff, because I think that this is the way that you can lead a life of meaning as well, even if the world out there is really difficult.
Yes, you're absolutely right, and that is a great point. All of us have an outer purpose. We have jobs and we have families, and those are very important. Our outer purpose, but there has to be an inner purpose too, and that inner purpose is growth in our capacity to see beyond our ego. And it doesn't matter how many times we fall down. All of us are going to fall down over and over again. But even if one time a day we catch ourselves, the value of that, the compounding that goes on for that, you'll be amazed at the place you'll be in a month or 6 months from now. So it doesn't matter how many times you fall down. be kind for you falling down also. Don't judge yourself. Your judging will keep you in place, will stop you from changing. Because the same voice in your head that judges you is the voice that's judging other people, right? So,
yes.
So you can't stop judging other people by judging yourself. That doesn't work either.
Right. And that's a tough one to swallow for many people, I think, because it's easier. If you are the type of person who is interested in doing this kind of work, that's often the one part that can be really difficult and complex to say, oh, well, I have to apply this first to myself, and then it will help me in extending that outwards. So I guess that this is really part of the way to insulate from the tribalism and the totalitarianism that can creep up, right, and that already exists in other countries right now. Barry, this has been lovely. Do you have anything that you would like to add? Any last thoughts on tribalism for our listeners?
No, I think you gave a great, summary, and it's always a, pleasure, because it's always a learning that goes on through our, conversation for each other, and hopefully for those people who have given an hour to sit and hear us, it's always a, great conversation. So, thank you very much.
Likewise, you're very welcome. I hope to have you on here again very soon.
It'd be great to come back again soon. Thanks. But that there's a certain coolness by having this spontaneous, conversation as opposed to PowerPoint slides and everything, right?
Yeah. Yes, it's different, and it can be difficult when you're a writer, because you can have this way of collecting and organizing your thoughts and really plotting everything out. And this, as I've said before, though, I think you add a lot of value to people in hearing your thought process as well. And it's really a pleasure to listen to you as well as to read your work, and you kind of get to see your thinking here behind what goes into your essays. So I think that's really valuable and helpful for people.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the essays, of course, are far more, formal, and I hope that people who had gone through, who heard us, will then go to the essays to get the more formal, presentation as opposed to the informal. All the years I taught, I did have PowerPoint slides, but honestly, here's the interesting thing. I never knew what was coming up in the deck. Now that sounds nuts, but I did create the slides. And it was nothing I ever read. It was to keep me moving in a certain way. So I'd have a quotation.
I totally get it.
I'd have a quotation on a page, and I'd click the slide, and okay, that's what's next. And I never talked about it the same way twice. It was always something new. So I was always entertained, and I think the students were entertained because I was entertained always. It was always fresh for me. I always was often amazed at the stuff.